Are you up for a self-published sequel that has more magic, more monster people, and more of a corporately run oppressive cyberpunk regime? Then I got you. Hello, and welcome to the Ponderings of Pete. I am Pete, and this is my channel. I talk about sci-fi, I talk about fantasy, some things that are in between, but mostly fantasy, honestly. If you are a first-time watcher, thank you so much. I really appreciate you popping by. There's a like button, a subscribe button if you want to see more, and a comment box as well. If you are, if you've read any of this author's published works, or you just think this looks cool, let me know down in the comments. And if you are returning, thank you so much. I really appreciate all your guys' support and, all your comments and interactions. Because honestly, this is all just about talking about books. So I appreciate those of you that are here for it. Now, let's talk about The Rebel by J.R. Tross. This is the second book in a series. I have done a review for the first book, which is The Rave, linked up below. Actually, not really linked up below, but linked up above. I don't know where words are, but it's fine. And, I definitely was interested enough in the first book that I wanted a sequel, and the author has delivered. This book is a little bit bigger, a couple hundred pages bigger than the first book, but it all works out in the end. This book definitely plays more into the themes of just oppressive government that were slightly evident in the first one, but more focused on the excessive side of the populace, whereas this one really focuses on just the government and how it oppresses the people, the elves, aka monster people, essentially, and how it changes things to fit its own ends. I'm going to try to keep this spoiler-free for the most part, and maybe some light spoilers from the first book, but very, very little, honestly. My plan is to very obliquely reference things that happened in the first book. So this book starts out with a time jump from the last one of about 2 years, because we left our main character, Alina, and she was going in for training. And this book starts with that. You have about 150 pages of learning about the magic she's learning about just what she's learning, and catching up with her and Cho from the last book. Alina leaves off basically exactly where we left her, and then Cho feels like there's been a lot more happening in the past 2 years, so we have to catch up with her a little bit. She starts out as like almost a underground wannabe rebel icon, and then that's kind of feels like it's backed off a little bit as the story goes on, in order to make room for the character arc that she goes through. Alina's entire story, her arc, very much feels like a natural progression, where she is just dealing with who she is now, dealing with destiny and her grandfather's wishes, and resolving all of that within herself, while she tries to just maintain being herself through it all and not letting it all change her too much. Cho had a very interesting arc that the arc really picked up at the very last, like the last 200 pages or so, and definitely with all of these characters, they're very introspective characters. There's a lot of internal conflict going on inside them, mostly about identity, who they are, what their place is in the world. And this is definitely a world to figure that out in, because the main villain could arguably be the government, be this nebulous, oppressive regime that's trying to beat down on everybody, where they basically rule all of the known Earth, except they don't, because they lie and twist the truth. The city where a vast majority of this book takes place is really fascinating. I honestly wish there had been more exploration of the city than was done in this book. Sometimes when you have super long page time, it's not easy to explore as much, because you have to be tighter with your words almost, or the extra stuff that you tack on. The other thing that I'll say about kind of the overall plot of this book, the first book felt like it had more purpose. It definitely started out a lot more explosively, whereas this book started out with a training sequence, and it felt like the plot thrust kind of just fell together. Like, oh, it just happens that XYZ, XYZ, and XYZ intersects. Let's just do this. Our villains, going back to definitely the government, it felt like a lot of our villain interaction was with fighting faceless soldiers. It wasn't until the back part of the book, the last act of the book, that the faces of our villains really kind of appeared and started really hounding our heroes. But that climax, the final act, whatever you want to call it, was really... It was a pretty long one. You kind of go into it thinking, oh, this kind of feels like the final act of the book. And recently I've been reading a lot of books where the final act feels really, really short. Like, it's like, oh, we're going into the end game of the book, and I have like 50 pages left. I'm like, wow, that's a really short time to finish this whole thing up. Whereas this book, it felt like we were going into that end game stage, and there were still 200 pages left. So that was a nice feeling, because a lot of stuff does happen in the climax. It's not where the one thing drags out over 50 to 100 pages, and then we, move on slightly. A lot happens in those 200 pages, contrasting with, the first 100 pages, where it did feel like that not a lot was happening. We were just being told a bunch of things about the training. I like the setup for the next book. I think there's a little bit more of a concrete setup for this one, for the third book. But overall, I did really like this. I did really... I enjoyed my time with it. It took me a little bit to get through just because I started reading out on ebook. And I'm not a fan of that. But that was literally just me. The biggest thing that was really awesome in this book was the expansion of the magic, the expansion of the elf. It's basically his different races of monstrous and fairy-like creatures. This book had more of those. You interacted with more of these intelligent beings that are not human, which was great to see. If you're really interested in the magic, the first 100 pages or so will not feel as slow, because you're getting these, trainings about the magic so you can understand what's happening in, different pieces. So that was really cool to see expansions of this magic, as well as just, the elves. And it's another thing, like, hey, let's see more and more of this. Like, I wouldn't mind seeing most of the next book happen within elf society, now that we know that elf society exists. That these monstrous creatures are can coexist with each other and live together. So I would love to see that, especially considering the end of the book and where Cho and Lena end up at the end of the book. So definitely feels like a very epic fantasy overall. I definitely enjoyed this, and I'm looking forward to the last book, which is called The Ruin. Thank you so much for watching, and make sure to get some rest, because rest is super important. Have a great night.